All right, we are back with a new video, and we are continuing with this series of ranking the MLP episodes, this time doing season 3, the short season of the show. And season 3 is not the best season in my personal opinion. I mean, while it's not a terrible season, and there are definitely some good episodes within it, I don't think this season quite has the highs that a lot of other seasons of the show does. Some of that is due to the shortened length, but some of that is just due to the episodes we have to deal with here. So that is something to keep in mind as we go through this. And as I said, this is the shortest season. It is only 12 episodes. Again, assuming that the Crystal Empire is being counted as just one episode. But it was also a season that people widely thought was going to be the last season of the show, as the episode 13, Magical Mystery Cure, was the 65th episode, and it ended in a way that made it seem like it could have been the series finale, only for it to later be announced that no, the series would continue. So this is an interesting season to talk about, and we're going to be doing this episode ranking here. But as usual, there are 12 episodes to rank here, and let's just get right into the list. So starting off at number 12, the worst episode of season 3 was a bit of a toss-up for me, as there are two episodes that I think are really, really bad. One is pretty notably bad and is widely regarded as one of the worst episodes of the series. The other one is also pretty bad, but is a bit more forgotten in the grand scheme of things, but it's still very bad. And I did consider putting that episode at the bottom here. And I feel like at the end of the day, these episodes are pretty close. But I decided to go with what I consider the more broken episode and the more notable episode. But here at number 12, we do have One Bad Apple. And I already talked about this episode in my CMC episode ranking, so you can check that out. And I'm sure a lot of people already recognize the flaws with this episode. I mean, to go through them, the episode is supposed to be a bullying episode, and it is supposed to break down the issues with bullying. It's supposed to teach the audience that if there's an issue, you're supposed to open up and tell an adult about it so that they can hopefully resolve the issue. Except it doesn't really teach that because, for one, Applejack is pretty useless across the episode. She never seems to notice that, Babseeds is being a bully or that it's negatively affecting Apple Bloom and her friends, even when it's made very obvious. There are multiple times in the episode where Applejack probably should have taken a hint, most notably when Babseeds allowed their cart to come crashing out of the barn in order to destroy it and force them to start over. That definitely should have drawn some attention there, but it just didn't happen. And we see that they don't come forward because they don't want to be snitches. And yet, come on, there are definitely times where Applejack should have stepped forward a bit more. And then the one time where Applejack is useful is just to tell them that Babseeds was being bullied back home in Manhattan, and that it's a good thing that they've been quote unquote good friends to her and helping her settle in all nicely. And this is just meant to make the CMC in the wrong for wanting to get revenge against Babseeds during the parade, which, again, would have been a lot more useful had she told them this at the beginning of the episode, like maybe before Babseeds even arrived in Ponyville. Maybe Applejack tells Apple Bloom that she should really try to be nice to Babseeds because she's been bullied and maybe just isn't used to kindness. So, again, there was so much reason for Applejack to tell this information sooner, but just didn't up until the point where it puts the CMC in the wrong for daring to get their revenge against Babseeds. And in general, the whole chain of responsibility is pretty backwards as well, where it's okay for Babseeds to bully the CMC because she's been bullied, and it's wrong for the CMC to retaliate even though they've been bullied themselves, and by the logic of this episode, they should have been in the right to bully and sort of continue this chain of bullying. And I get that they wanted to break that chain. However, they don't really give Babseeds the accountability that she probably should have for bullying the CMC as much as he did. Instead, it really just waits until the end, until they pretty unceremoniously, give Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon their just desserts, which, again, isn't great that they're putting all the blame on those two when Babseeds still had some agency in all this. So again, this is all very bad. And to this day, this is still a very broken episode. It doesn't tell the message that it intends to, and it gets some issues pretty wrong. And in general, Applejack's role in the episode is pretty frustrating and is a big reason why the conflict is allowed to perpetuate as much as it does. However, there are a couple saving factors to keep it from being among the very, very worst. I think, for one, the song is okay. I mean, I know that I'm not a huge fan of earworm songs, but it does at least have that. And also, I will say that the beginning of the episode, when Babseeds is settling in and before she turns into a bully, is at least somewhat interesting, especially knowing that she was bullied beforehand. It's just interesting seeing her be all nervous and stuff. But those two things were considerations for why this episode should be a little bit higher in the list, as they do slightly give me some enjoyment with this episode. However, at the end of the day, it is still a fundamentally broken episode, and I can't really defend its message. I can't defend the way that it delivers its message, and I can't really defend the way in which a story is carried out. So for all those reasons, this is the worst episode of season 3, and it is here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we are talking about the episode that I alluded to a moment ago, but here we have Just for Sidekicks. And I alluded to this a moment ago, but I actually think Just for Sidekicks is a lot less fun to rewatch than One Bad Apple, in the sense that it is basically a Spike torture porn for a lot of it, where the episode goes so far out of its way to punish Spike for his selfishness, where he wants to get these gems in order to bake a cake, which, by the way, the whole premise is pretty dumb, where it starts with him already having gems to make his cake, but then he accidentally eats them, which prompts him to go out to each of the main 6 to try to get gems from them in exchange for full sitting their pets while they go off to the Crystal Empire. And the episode wants to teach the lesson that Spike is biting off more than he can chew, that he took on all this responsibility for selfish gain, and in turn, he has to learn that there are consequences to that action. But the issue is the episode goes so far out of its way to punish Spike for this action that it basically becomes unenjoyable, where, I mean, yes, he does bite off more than he can chew, and the episode does to a degree focus on that by him losing the pets and him having to spend all this time in order to find them and make sure that he doesn't get into trouble and that they don't get hurt and stuff, which is all right. The problem comes when the episode pretty much enforces this punishment by making him have to give up each of the gems one at a time until he essentially has none left. And it's so forced, really. Like, he has to pay the CMC a gem in order for them to watch the pets for him, but then they just lose them, and that just continues the problem. He then has to pay the pony on the train a gem in order to get onto the train, which, why? Like, since when are gems legal tender when they're supposed to be food? I mean, that's pretty confusing. And we just see this throughout the episode where Spike is just being punished for seemingly no reason, and the episode is being so blatant in punishing him when really they could have just focused on him losing the pets and just him dealing with the consequences of his actions in a more organic way. But instead, we literally had to watch all these scenes of him coughing up the gems, really hammering home the fact that he screwed up and he has to pay the price. And it's just not fun, in my opinion. And that's a big reason why this episode is as low as it is. But the reason I have it above One Bad Apple is that, as forced and as unpleasant as this episode is to watch, it at least has a coherent message of don't bite off more than you can chew. And if you're going to take on responsibilities that are important, you probably shouldn't do it for selfish gain, and that you should probably do it for the sake of it rather than just for the reward. So that's at least somewhat coherent as a message. But it's just the way it's delivered is so ham-fisted, and it's so blatantly designed to make Spike this chew toy for a lot of it. That makes me put this episode here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have a slightly similar episode to Just for Sidekicks, but it's really more boring than a slog to get through. And here we have Spike at your service. And this episode is kind of similar to Just for Sidekicks in that it's a Spike episode. It's about him basically subordinating himself and just him looking like a fool for a lot of it, where he gets saved by Applejack and then he has to essentially be his servant for Applejack, except he keeps screwing up each of the tasks. And it's so apparent that Applejack wants nothing to do with this, but Spike keeps insisting that he be her servant due to the Dragon Code, which, by the way, the Dragon Code, I already talked about this in previous videos, is a pretty dumb concept, and the fact that it's only brought up in this episode is pretty ridiculous in my personal opinion, and it really just serves to make this episode drag as much as it does. But unlike Just for Sidekicks, I just find the episode really boring, where a lot of it is Spike trying to help Applejack, he screws it up, or Applejack tries to get Spike to not be a servant anymore, but then him just seeing through it or just resolving the problem immediately. It's just pretty boring for a lot of it. So because of that, it is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another really boring episode in my opinion. It's actually related to Just for Sidekicks. We have Gaines Ponies Play, and this episode really dragged in my opinion, especially with the knowledge that the tourist that the ponies thought was the judge, Miss Harshwini, isn't the actual person that they were looking for, is really what drags this episode down, because again, it makes the episode reliant on this miscommunication plot. The fact that the main six are so vague when talking to the tourist, thinking that's Miss Harshwini, the fact that they never say her name, the fact that they make it so vague to where the tourist can never really correct them on the situation, in the fact that we literally have multiple instances of the actual Miss Harshwini, trying to get around only for her to not have the best time, just isn't very fun to watch. And really, for all intents and purposes, this should have disqualified the Crystal Empire from participating, because yeah, we see towards the end that Miss Harshwini hears from the tourist about how great of a reception that they got and how they really were able to make this tourist feel special, which I guess is an excuse. But then again, all it does is show that, oh, well, you're only being nice to me because I am the pony of importance, and why didn't I get that reception? And I feel like through that, Miss Harshwini really had no reason to accept their bid for the Equestria Games, but it is what it is. But really, it's just the knowledge that this isn't the pony that they were looking for, and so much of the plot does rely on this miscommunication that really drags it down for me, makes it just not that interesting to watch. Now, the one thing that does make this episode a little interesting is the fact that it does run alongside Just for Sidekicks, that takes place at the same time. And obviously, this isn't the first time or the only time that they do this in the series, but I guess it's something at least. But at the end of the day, this is just a super boring episode that relies on a dumb plot. So because of that, it is here number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8. And I know there are people that enjoy this episode quite a lot. And it's not necessarily that I don't like this episode. It's just not my thing personally. But here we have Magic Duel, aka the return of Trixie. And I will say up front that I do kind of like Trixie in this episode, in the sense that obviously I talked about with Ghostbusters how she wasn't really that bad in that episode, and yet it was the self-righteousness of the main six that led to her downfall. And it is somewhat interesting for her to come back here and explain how that decision from Ghostbusters and what happened there really destroyed a lot of her livelihood, and she is sort of back for revenge, which, if you know what ends up happening with Starlight later on, is an interesting parallel to consider here. So there's at least that going on. However, the actual episode itself isn't really my thing. I mean, a lot of it is Trixie casting spells on other people, like erasing Pinky's mouth or making Snips and Snails his servant, and really turning everyone in Ponyville into her servants. And a lot of it is Twilight sort of outside the town, getting training from Zecora, and a lot of it just feels like your standard action plot. And it's not really my thing per se, but I will acknowledge that Trixie's role in the episode and her motivation for coming back and really getting revenge on the people that destroyed her livelihood for seemingly no like substantially good reason is at least something in my opinion, but it's just this episode just isn't my thing. I'm not a huge fan of this genre, and because of that, it is here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and I feel like this episode is largely around the same level as Magic Duel, and realistically, I think a rewatch could cause me to switch places with Magic Duel in this episode. However, I feel like for this list at least, I decided to give this one the edge, and here we have Wonderbolts Academy, and this episode is largely alright as well. Now, it does have a lot of your standard tropes with like boot camp and Rainbow Dash finally getting her dream and getting to experience the Wonderbolts on the inside for the first time, like dealing with the high expectations, obviously meeting Lightning Dust and having to deal with her competitiveness. And we see Rainbow Dash really struggle with compromising her morals, and then towards the end, making it so that she decided to choose her friends over her dream. And that was a pretty interesting scene of her approaching Spitfire and telling her that she would rather quit the Wonderbolts than having to put her friends in danger, or at least not have that condemned. So I found that interesting. And plus, I do like Pinky's storyline this episode as well, where she gets pretty clingy with Rainbow Dash, with her constantly wanting letters out there and her getting a bit crazy when Rainbow Dash doesn't really write her letters, and then when they eventually come to visit her, she's able to have a bit of a wholesome reunion, so that's something at least. And plus, considering my thoughts on Pinky as a character, I find this to be a pretty interesting episode for her on the whole. So at least those are things that I did give credit to Wonderbolts Academy, and a big reason why I decided to give this episode the edge over Magic Duel. But at the end of the day, I feel like these episodes are largely around the same level. I can't say that they're among my favorites. However, I don't have anything too negative to say about them. So because of that, I had this episode here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we kind of have a more enjoyable episode to talk about here, at least for me. Although even then I acknowledge that it's not necessarily the best. But here we have Apple Family Reunion. And I do enjoy this episode in the sense that it encapsulates this family reunion pretty well and does a good job at showing the history behind it all. And we see Applejack very much care about wanting this tradition to be upheld in the best possible way. Now, this isn't the only episode of the series that delves into this particular issue, but this is sort of something that resonates with me pretty well. I mean, I remember myself growing up, like finding certain traditions to be pretty interesting, like especially ones that involved a large grouping of people coming together and really putting on something spectacular. So I understand Applejack's motivation for wanting to make this event as special as possible. And in turn, we see her really struggle to do so, not so much because she doesn't care, but because she gets so wrapped up in the image of this family reunion and all these specific events being as grand and spectacular as possible, that she doesn't stop to consider what the others actually want and what makes the actual event special. It isn't so much the activities being done as it is about the ponies getting to interact with each other and really getting to know more about each other, which at the end of the day is what the family reunion is supposed to be about. So I find that conflict to be pretty interesting. And plus, the song is pretty interesting. I mean, I know it hasn't necessarily been my favorite across time, but it has sort of grown on me as time has gone on. So I do appreciate the story in that sense. However, I can't have the episode ranked too highly because it still has some slow points, particularly in the middle part. And plus, I can't really like prop it up too much beyond my own personal enjoyment of it. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we got a very interesting episode to discuss here. And actually the episode that many people thought could have been the series finale, but obviously we ended up being wrong. And here we have Magical Mystery Cure. And essentially, I view this episode very similar to the QD Remark in the sense that I do enjoy watching the episode on the whole, but I can acknowledge that there are plenty of flaws with it. Now, let's start with the pros, which starts with the music. I think the music here is pretty good for the most part. Now, admittedly, I don't like every song. Like, I Gotta Find a Way is pretty boring. And even What My Cutie Mark Is Telling Me is largely okay. I mean, it's not a bad song, but it's also not really my jam. But there's still pretty good songs in here. I mean, the opening number is pretty good. It's sort of like Belle from Beauty and the Beast. I also like A True True Friend, as it's pretty wholesome on the whole. There's also Celestia's Ballad, which is also pretty good. So, in general, I think for the most part, the episode has pretty good music. And I'll also say, in terms of the pacing, I know people criticize the pacing, and yeah, it is technically an issue in the sense that the conflict is resolved around the 2/3 mark. However, I kind of view it similarly to Crusaders of the Lost Mark in the sense that I'm kind of glad that more of the episode wasn't dedicated to this straightforward story, as it allowed the rest of it to sort of transition into something a bit more significant. I mean, I'm kind of glad that this wasn't just your normal episode that was dedicated so much time to seeing the rest of the main six being miserable in their roles that they clearly were not built for. So I think to that end, the episode is pretty effective. And considering the significance of this episode for the series and for the plot development, I am understanding of that issue in the sense that they needed to do all this stuff in just 22 minutes. Now, onto the negatives. I think there are plenty of story and conceptual issues with this episode, mainly concerning the premise of the episode being Twilight casting the spell that causes the rest of the main six to like have their cutie marks altered. I think one issue is, why doesn't Twilight's cutie mark change as well, especially when it seems to imply that the spell screwed up all of the elements of harmony. Why didn't it mess up Twilight's cutie mark as well? I guess there's that to consider. There's also some weirdness in terms of memory and how the main six just wake up one day to have a completely different set of memories. I mean, they do kind of explain it, but it's still a bit confusing as well. There's also a confusion regarding the rest of the characters and how they seem to not have much memory of the rest of the main six. Like, why is Granny Smith and Apple Bloom allowing Pinky to work the farm, and why aren't they wondering where Applejack went, for example? So there's issues like that. Why aren't there other weather ponies getting in the way of what Rarity's trying to do by altering the weather? So there are some issues as well with how the spell functions and who it affects and how its effects are spread out. So I find that a bit confusing. I also don't like how this is the final test for Twilight to eventually become a princess, because we see in the season premiere that Twilight got a test of like working to save the Crystal Empire. That was largely meant as setup for Celestia intending Twilight to have bigger plans that would eventually result in her becoming princess. So then why is this, of all things, her final test? Was Celestia expecting Twilight to screw up the spell along the way, only to fix it later on? I mean, there's also like her reasoning of how she created magic, whatever that means. Like, how is that related to her becoming the princess of friendship? And I kind of get that, like the segment in which Celestia is explaining everything and showing all the flashbacks, it sort of implies that it's really a culmination of all the efforts that she was doing with building friends, learning these lessons, and then saving Equestria. And I guess Twilight recognized that like the power of friendship was the key to solving the spell. So then why is this specific incident, more so than all the other stuff that she did, really that final test? It's sort of unclear there. And really, when you think about it, it is a bit underwhelming as well. So I do have issues with this episode in terms of its concept, in terms of why Celestia chose this specific moment for Twilight to be coronated as the princess. So there are definitely some issues there, but all things considered, I do enjoy this episode quite a lot, and I do get plenty of enjoyment from it. But similar to the cutie remark, there are enough issues, technically speaking, with it that I can't have it too high. Because of that, it is here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and I kind of can't believe the amount of times that I talked about this specific episode already on this channel. But with the videos that I have made before, that's just how it broke down. But we have the premiere of the season, we have the Crystal Empire. And I know that in the past when I talked about this episode, it's always kind of been in the middle of the road where, yeah, it's pretty solid, but it's not particularly one that I regard as that special. And I still feel like that's largely the case. However, when we're looking at this list, ranking all the season 3 episodes, it's definitely in the top half for sure. And I do like it as a two-parter on the whole. There's plenty of good storylines here, particularly with them trying to save the Crystal Empire, with us getting to learn a bit about the Crystal Empire. However, it's never really explained what the purpose of it is or what really distinguishes it from like Equestria, outside the fact that it disappeared for 1,000 years and the fact that it's situated in the middle of the North Pole. Like culturally, what distinguishes the Crystal Ponies from, say, Equestria? It's never made super clear in that regard. But there's plenty of good moments from this episode, like the Nightmare Door. That's always one of my favorite scenes, when Twilight sees Celestia telling her that she failed the test and that she was disowning her as a student, only for Spike to immediately access the door, and we see his reaction to his worst nightmare playing out of Twilight disowning him. I always find that pretty interesting. We, of course, get to the scene towards the end where Spike is ultimately the one to save the day, and Twilight, well, like allowing this to happen the moment given the circumstances, she walks away feeling like she failed the test. So there's that to consider. And I do like the songs in this episode, both the Failure song and the Crystal Empire ballad. I do enjoy those songs quite a bit. I do still think that part two is a bit slow compared to part one, where a lot of it does focus on the festival, and I don't find a lot of those antics super interesting, especially when season 6, The Crystalling, does a very similar plot development, with the rest of the main six trying to keep the Crystal Ponies out of the loop behind some crisis that's taking place, so there's that. But I still think this is a pretty solid two-parter on the whole, and I have already talked about in previous videos, and it is good enough to be here at number 4 for this list. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I feel like this is sort of the top tier of this list in terms of me thinking that all 3 of these episodes are pretty solid, and it's just a matter of the order. But at number 3, we have actually the only episode left that I haven't talked about in a previous video, and that is Too Many Pinkie Pies. Now, if you know me and how I feel about Pinkie, this is obviously one that was probably going to be high on the list anyway, but I do enjoy this episode quite a lot, with Pinkie having a pretty relatable dilemma and one that's very fitting of her character. The fact that she dedicates her life to trying to make as many people happy as possible, and her having to deal with the fact that she literally can't be in 2 places at once, and her worrying that her picking one place over another is going to disappoint whoever she doesn't pick, which leads her to essentially clone herself and in turn like make it so that she can experience multiple things. Now obviously she doesn't seem to realize that she technically isn't actually experiencing the same stuff, as she's really just relying on one of her clones in order to do it, but there's that at least. And we see this plan eventually go south when she clones too many versions of herself, to where a lot of them essentially become flanderized versions of herself. And that's one thing I really do enjoy about this episode, is the fact that the episode is very much centering around the fact that Pinkie is often perceived as this comic relief character that doesn't really offer much and largely is annoying to other people. And it's really a matter of digging down to get to who Pinkie is at her core, someone that has a range of emotions and someone that is capable of complex thought, that's capable of more than just what you expect out of this silly comic relief character. And considering those are pretty central things that I like about Pinkie, obviously the fact that the episode focuses so much on that is a pro that I will give this episode. Now, onto the knocks. I mean, I still think this episode does kind of suffer towards the end, particularly with the whole test of having all the Pinkie clones watching paint dry, and Twilight literally murdering each of the clones that failed the test. Now, of course, she isn't technically murdering them, she's just sending them back to the mirror pool, but she gets way too much enjoyment out of vaporizing each of these clones. And if you had seen my April Fool's video, I mean, this scene doesn't look too good for her. So the fact that she gets all this enjoyment out of it, plus the test itself is pretty imperfect, to where even the actual Pinkie, who does care enough about her friends to go through with it, I mean, she very easily could have slipped up, and through that, she could have failed the test. Also, the fact that we see that the earlier clones were definitely much closer to Pinky in terms of her complexity. We see the first Pinky clone even like get emotional when she misses out on certain things, which implies that that original clone is much closer to who Pinky is as a person, and therefore probably had much more of a reason to keep existing. So I feel like the episode doesn't really reconcile that too well. I mean, in fact, the episode even implies towards the end that the other Pinky clone remained, the last one remaining aside from the real one, was the original clone, the one that was most similar to Pinky. And the fact that they basically say that that version doesn't deserve to exist despite having the complexity of the actual Pinky is a pretty troubling prospect, if you ask me. And again, the fact that Twilight gets so much enjoyment out of killing off all these clones is a bit upsetting. But this episode still accomplishes quite a bit in the fact that it is so central to elements of Pinky that I enjoy, and Pinky is a character that I enjoy a lot, is a big reason this episode is as high as it is, but it's those knocks that keep it down. So I leave it here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have a pretty interesting episode to talk about. And as I talked about with number 3, these top 2 episodes are ones that I have already talked about in previous videos, so it's just a matter of the order. But at number 2, we do have Keep Calm and Flutter On. And I've already talked about this before in previous videos, but even though I don't personally like Discord that much as a character, I do think he has a very strong redemption arc, and this episode is obviously what kickstarts that redemption arc. Now, I do think this episode does have some issues in terms of explaining its own existence, like the fact that Celestia decides out of the blue that Discord needs to be reformed and that his powers can somehow be used for good is a bit far-fetched in my opinion. I mean, considering their history together, I don't think Celestia had too much of a reason to believe that those powers could be used for good. So I feel like the episode didn't really do the best job at justifying its own existence. And I've heard some people in the past say that this felt a lot like the premise of a fan fiction, not necessarily in the most flattering way. So I think that is a bit of a knock there. And I also do knock the ending a bit in the sense that Discord does come around a bit too quickly, with Fluttershy literally saying, "I am not your friend." And then Discord lasts for like half a second, but then he just tears up and he's like, "Well played, Fluttershy." I found that to be a bit rushed. And in general, I know a lot of people have criticized this episode, especially at the time that it aired. I mean, it's really only with what we know about Discord after the fact, particularly the fact that he isn't somehow automatically nice now, that he's still prone to being a bit of a jerk, even though he is technically reformed. I think this episode has been vindicated to a certain degree, but I still know some people that criticize the issue of Fluttershy giving Discord all these chances to be good, even though Discord is clearly manipulating her and taking advantage of her hospitality for a lot of it. But I think that's just it with me. I think that is part of what makes Discord's redemption arc so interesting for me. The fact that he doesn't automatically play by their rules just because they give him another chance. The fact that he is able to twist, the mission statements of the main 6 here in order to keep doing what he's doing. Like he tells them that they're all about friendship and giving people second chances, and that it's not fair for them to pass judgment on him, even though he is clearly not adopting too many of the lessons there. And I do enjoy like sort of that conflict, as well as Fluttershy sort of having to defend her element for a lot of this, the element of kindness, by giving Discord all these chances, even though her friends are clearly reminding her over and over that Discord isn't making that much progress. So I find a lot of that element to be pretty interesting. And I do like that moment where she does snap at the end. Again, I still think it's a bit rushed, but I do find it an interesting element that she is able to get Discord to warm up to her enough to where he sort of realizes after the fact that, hey, maybe he does care about friendship, even though he didn't really want to admit it for himself. So I do find a lot of that pretty interesting. And considering how much I think Discord's redemption arc is pretty good, I do give this episode a lot of credit in terms of setting it up. And I think the main issues with the episode come with the fact that it doesn't set itself up super well. Like, it doesn't give a good reason for why Celestia should believe that this is even a good idea to begin with. And again, the ending is a bit rushed as well. So those are knocks against the episode to a degree. But I still think this is a pretty good episode, all things considered, and a big reason that I have it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best episode of season 3 for me is Sleepless in Ponyville. And I feel like this was a pretty conventional pick. This is widely regarded as a pretty solid episode, and that's largely how I feel about it. Scootaloo is my favorite of the CMC, so it kind of makes sense that I would find some enjoyment here, but I do like the way that she was characterized here, and the way that sort of builds upon her relationship with Rainbow Dash across these first 3 seasons, where it seemed like in a lot of those early appearances that Scootaloo was a bit of an annoying fan of Rainbow Dash, someone that very much looked up to Rainbow, while Rainbow in turn very much tried to exude this image of being cool and how not being cool is somehow lame. And we really see in this episode this dynamic come to light where Scootaloo very much wants Rainbow Dash's approval. However, she sees her own fears as a bit unbecoming and a bit lame, and she very much tries to cover that up. And that culminates with her trying to run away from her fears, getting herself into some danger, causing Rainbow Dash to swoop in to save the day. Rainbow Dash gets a bit mad at her for running off, and then she finally opens up about her fears and wanting to be Rainbow Dash's wing pony, and then them really bonding and building their relationships there. So it is a very solid episode and not one that I have too many complaints about, all things considered. I think this is a pretty important episode for Scootaloo and Rainbow Dash's relationship, and it is pretty heartening to see Scootaloo sort of open up a bit, while in turn Rainbow Dash is able to see Scootaloo as a bit more than some random fan, but someone that very much wants to be a part of Rainbow Dash's life. There's also the element in this episode of Rainbow Dash being Scootaloo's main 6 counterpart, while despite her not technically being her family member. And we see that issue of Scootaloo not really having anyone like that, with Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle being able to turn to Apple, Jack, and Rarity, like during the trip, to bond with them, to sort of be that big sister figure, while Scootaloo is trying to get that in Rainbow Dash, but is a bit too scared to be open and really approach her. So I do find that a bit interesting as well. And on the whole, I just think this is a pretty solid episode. Now, is it the very best of the series? I mean, I don't necessarily think so. I think there are plenty of episodes that do manage to top it, but I think this episode does have a very solid foundation, and it does provide some interesting characterization, and it is a pretty wholesome watch, all things considered. And when we're looking at the rest of the field for season 3, it is definitely the most complete episode and the most solid episode. And because of that, I decided to have it here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And as I said, I am doing this as part of a bigger project where I am doing these episode rankings for each season. So next up will be season 4, and of course the subsequent seasons moving forward. And eventually I do plan to make one massive episode ranking, which is going to take forever, but it's something that I've wanted to do since making this channel and really dedicating more time to it. So stay tuned for all that. I do have other videos planned moving forward, so stay tuned for those as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.